Hi there, and welcome to One History Help with me, Mrs. O'Neill, where we will be today talking through America in the 1960s and a little bit into the 1970s as well. Now, for those of you studying AQA GCSE history, America, Opportunity and Inequality, these are your final 2 decades that you learn about. I feel that can be a little bit misleading from the point of view of history, because it gives the impression that by the time the 1960s have come to an end, then all of the past problems with America have been wrapped up nicely and America was a completely integrated society, no racism, no sexism or anything like that, which I'm hoping, as you're hearing me saying these words, we realise just isn't the case whatsoever. So, as always, hope you have got anything you need to make any notes that you would like to, or maybe you're just going to sit and listen and take in the information. And remember, it's not a problem if you look at something and you think, my gosh, I know this already. That's absolutely fine. In fact, that is the ideal in this situation. Please forgive me. As I'm recording this, it's quite warm today when I'm recording it. I've got my windows open, so we might have a little bit of background noise, hopefully not too much though. The 1960s in America is a really significant decade in terms of historical events that have a lasting impact on our world, and it's interesting to see which of these don't make the cut in terms of what we learn about under the, for instance, from AQA's syllabus point of view. I'm going to start, I won't talk about all of these pictures because actually the 3 along the bottom are very much going to prove to be the framing for what we learn about the 1960s, but the 3 at the top there are ones that we don't really get to go into in much detail. In no particular order really, I guess, starting with the middle one is the picture, the photograph there, as some of you may have seen it before, is taken moments before the assassination of JFK, one of the most famous events of the 1960s, you could argue, happens very, very early on and has a really interesting impact from a historian point of view about how we remember President Kennedy. He seems to have a very, very popular image in American history, and many historians argue that that really is, how can I put it, undeserving somewhat. Not to say that JFK wasn't an unpleasant guy, but I think a lot of people, because of his assassination, really tend to overplay the role that he had. He was a really new president for America. We will talk about him a little bit when we look at the new frontier with JFK. He was a new president. He was a very young president, and you know, he kind of really sparked the hopes of the younger generation. But in terms of what he actually achieved, you could argue there's actually very little to show for it by the time he is assassinated in 1963. On the right to him there we have an image taken from a photograph from the war in Vietnam. Now some of you might be looking at this now and you have a Cold War study, for instance the expansion of communism in the East you might be looking at, and you know, the Vietnam War is incredibly interesting. There are so many different facets to it that, you know, I just adored learning about when I was at university, is when I learned about 1960s America in lots of detail, from the point of view of how it impacted on politics, how it impacted on culture, how it impacted on America internationally, how it impacted on America in terms of their legacy as well, because the war in Vietnam is one that isn't really spoken about very often. And I'm talking about this now when a couple of days ago it was Memorial Day in America, which is their day when they honour their veterans. And you know, not that I say they ignore the Vietnam War veterans, but generally speaking, the Vietnam War isn't one they tend to refer to very often, because essentially it's a war that they lose. It's a war that they were never really fit to fight in, and a lot of historians will argue didn't need to be there in the first place either. Again, I think the reason AQA haven't included it in the study is because it doesn't really fit in with the social side of American history that the AQA GCSE focuses on. It's a lot more to do with international relations, especially between America and the USSR as well. But a really, really fascinating part of American history that goes from the mid-1960s, roughly about 1964, you could argue, into the mid-1970s as well. And then off to the left there, right at the end of the decade, we have got the moon landing. We celebrated the, let's have a think, do my maths now, the 50th, that was it. Oh no, 60th, my apologies, sorry, 60th anniversary of the moon landing last year. Is that right? Hang on, 1969, 2019. 50th, there we go. Good job I'm not a maths teacher. Sorry, the 50th anniversary of the moon landing last year. And you know, all you conspiracy theorists out there can think what you like about it, but it was a really significant moment, especially for that space race between America and the USSR. Other things that are happening that aren't mentioned on here, again, this big boom in culture in the 1960s. We've got lots of stuff to do with music around this time. The kind of some would argue somewhat sanitized version of rock and roll music gets a little bit darker and a little bit more intense during the 1960s, especially later on. We get the Woodstock Festival that some of you might have heard about towards the end of the 1960s as well. We've got the counterculture with hippies going on in the 60s too. But these are all really interesting parts that don't really fall into the spectrum of what we're looking at. But I wanted to have a chance to talk to you about how rich and diverse the different elements of the 1960s were, because like I said, those three pictures down the bottom really sum up what we're going to be focusing on when we look at our study from 1960s America. This list goes through it in a lot more detail. As you can see, 5 out of our 7 points are going to be looking at the progression in rights for Black people. We're then going to spend a little bit of time looking at women's rights, and then looking at 2 ideas known as the New Frontier and the Great Society. But like I said, as you can see, a lot of this is about the gaining of equal rights for Black people. Remember the name of this course as well. It's Opportunity and Inequality. And again, with the fact that our study ends in the year 1973, it gives the impression that everything was nice and neatly tied up, that there was no inequality and plenty of opportunity by then. However, like I've said already, and hopefully as we're aware of, that just really wasn't the case. We're going to look at 2 events together to start off with. We're going to look at the sit-ins and the freedom rides as well. Just wanted to use this as an opportunity to plug a film that I really strongly recommend, and that film is The Butler. Now, the reason that I recommend it so much is because it covers a lot of the significant events in the civil rights movement through the mid-1950s through to the late 1960s as well. And their attention to detail with it, I think, is absolutely phenomenal. They show the sit-ins, and they don't only show the actual event itself that you can see in that picture on the left there. But what I really like about the film is that they go back and they talk about how the students who took part actually prepared for the sit-ins as well. Again, it's a little bit like Rosa Parks and I was talking about in the last video about the 1950s. You know, these protests that are going on don't just happen spontaneously. There's planning and thought that goes into them. They also depict the freedom rides as well. And apart from obviously any kind of live ideas from the time, there was no real live footage of the freedom rides about in terms of the significant moments of what happened, but I feel the film uses the primary evidence available to the experiences of those people who were on the freedom rides to depict just how horrific and terrifying the racist abuse they got was on that journey that they were taking. Let's have a look at these 2 events in more detail. So both the sit-ins and the freedom rides are led by a group called SNCC, and that stands for the Student Non-Violence Coordinating Committee. And I think the 2 things I would want to focus in on here is the word student and the word non-violence. For the vast majority of our study looking at Black people gaining equal rights, it's going to be based around passive resistance and non-violence. Gandhi was a massive inspiration with that in mind, and he very much inspires Martin Luther King, and Martin Luther King there goes on to inspire groups like CORE and SNCC as well about this idea of pacifism, okay, that only love can conquer hate. So the non-violent element of SNCC is very much apparent in the 1960s, in the early 1960s. As the 1960s go on and you get to the later 1960s, things start to change a little bit and they start to kind of push the whole Black power violent side of things. But at the beginning, with the events we're looking at here, we're very much looking at a non-violent group of people. The reason I wanted to pick out the students is that the 1960s internationally, I mean all around the world, is a really key time when we see a lot of groups gaining rights. So that be that in terms of race or in terms of gender. And a big part of that is that the younger generations are now coming of age to a point where they can actually speak their minds and say how unsatisfied and dissatisfied they are with the situation, with people not having equal rights. So these are, let's have a think. So if we're talking about students, we're looking at let's say on average age around the age of 20. So we're looking here at kids who were born in the 1940s. Yeah, born in the 1940s, probably baby boomers following on from World War II, or roughly around the beginning of World War II, maybe before America gets involved. And by the time we get through to the 1960s, they've been through the affluence of the 50s, and they're not kind of living with those traditional attitudes that so many of their generations before them have been living with. Remember, they've gone through the 50s with the likes of Eisenhower, for instance, who was a very popular president, who has really been in favour of this idea of desegregation, for instance. As we're going to see, women's rights sadly takes a back seat for quite some time. But this idea that when students get to a point where they can actually use their voice, they are very much in favour of this idea of equality. And like I said, that's not just the case in America, it is the case around the world as well. So the sit-ins, first of all, happen in the 1960s. There are lots of sit-ins across the country in America. The photograph that you can see beforehand and the one that features in the Butler is probably one of the most significant one. And it happens in a place called Greensboro in North Carolina. Now, the idea of a sit-in, again, is a peaceful protest where you essentially sit somewhere and won't be moved. I'm sure you've heard that protest phrase before, we shall not be moved. And again, the sit-ins would be done in places where they were intentionally challenging the segregation laws. Again, that one from Greensboro there in North Carolina is a famous one where they sat at a lunch counter that was segregated. So it had, and if you watch the film, you see this as well in The Butler, it kind of depicts it, I think, beautifully. We've got that long counter, this long lunch counter, and there is a section that is very much for white people, and there is a section for Black people, although they have the sign, the language they use on the sign is coloured. Again, not a terminology that we would use. And the idea is that the students, both black and white at this stage, I might add as well, another thing with the idea of these people coming of age is that it's not just black people who are campaigning for civil rights, it's also white people who are campaigning for the rights of black people as well. And they go on to sit at these lunch counters at the section for the white people, and they would not be moved until they are served. Now, in theory, they are breaking segregation laws because at this stage, lunch counters, restaurants and places like that had not been desegregated. So as they were breaking the law, they were arrested. However, and again, if you have a chance to look back at that picture and if you get a chance to watch the film, you will see that they are met with absolutely abhorrent levels of brutality from white people. I won't go into the details of what happens because I think, again, I feel the film especially communicates it in such a powerful way. And yeah, again, I don't want to spoil it, but interestingly, none of the white people who commit acts of violence towards these protesters are arrested. But the protesters who sit there and take that abuse, they're the ones who are arrested for breaking the segregation laws. Moving on to the Freedom Rides in May 1961, they're organised by SNCC and also another civil rights group that were created around the time of World War II is CORE, the Congress on Racial Equality. And unlike the sit-ins, there was only one Freedom Rides. There were lots of sit-ins, but there was only one Freedom Rides in May 1961. And this was a bus journey that was taken from Washington, D.C. to Jackson in Mississippi. And the idea is that they were testing the segregation laws for transport. If you think back to Rosa Parks and the Montgomery bus boycott, in theory, there was no segregation anymore on the buses or anything like that. And also that extended to the waiting rooms where you would wait to get on a bus. Now, a waiting room might sound kind of odd to us when we think about getting a bus, but what we need to be aware of is that in America, it was quite common for people to take bus journeys on significantly long distances and across long distances. So for instance, Washington to Jackson is quite a significant journey down through the southern states. You know, that would have taken quite some time. So it wasn't unusual for there to be quite big depots where you would go to get the bus. And they would have these waiting rooms, and again they would be segregated, so you'd have a waiting room for white people and a waiting room for black people. Now again, in theory, the law changed that and they wanted to test it. So what they thought was, well, the best way we can test it is by taking a ride of our own. So they get a bus of their own. It's not like a national bus or anything like that, and they ride the bus through on this journey, and at several points on their journey they are met with violence, and that especially takes place in Birmingham, Alabama, where the chief of police, a guy named Bull Connor, and trust me, he very much deserves that name. Bull Connor knew when the Freedom Riders were to be arriving in Birmingham, and he gave the police force, the entire police force were given the day off. And of course, there was tons of violence towards them, not just in Birmingham, like I said, but Birmingham is arguably where we see the worst of it happen. And of course, the people who were taking part in the Freedom Rides were arrested as well. And it's a really contentious idea because, like I said, in theory, the segregation laws didn't apply to transport anymore. But the further south you went, the more set in their ways they were. Incidentally, the Freedom Rides were meant to go all the way down to New Orleans, but they didn't make it. And they had to actually stop the journey that they were taking because of the level of violence that was going on. And President Kennedy actually threatens to get involved if the violence continued towards the Freedom Riders went on. So what they notice is the violence stops, but so much damage has been done, so many arrests have been made, despite the fact they have more and more people joining the Freedom Rides as they go on. It was just too risky. It was too dangerous the further south that they were going. But it's really interesting to see here is that Kennedy's doing almost what Eisenhower was doing back in the late 50s at Little Rock High School when he sent in those 1,100 paratroopers to protect the Little Rock Nine. Kennedy, a young president himself, is standing up and saying, you need to stop the violence towards these people, otherwise I will make you stop. And interestingly, this time, unlike, oh my God, his name is, I've got it. Unlike Orville Faubus down in Arkansas, who didn't listen to Eisenhower, the people in Alabama and those other areas did listen to him, and the violence stops. But sadly, so much damage had been done, the Freedom Rides were not able to continue. But I mentioned this last time, when I say last time, hopefully you've seen the 1950s video. When we were talking about Little Rock High School, when you're into the early 1960s, the kind of bad press that America was getting internationally was huge. Okay, this is one of the big reasons why Kennedy steps in to try and stop this. It's not because he deeply cares about the people involved. Yes, I'm sure there's an element of humanity in there, but it's also to do with the fact that America is coming across as like a bunch of thugs to the rest of the world. This world that is meant to stand up and represent freedom and integrity for all is looking really, really bad. So Kennedy, of course, needs to be seen to do something. So these are another good example. If we think back to the civil rights action that we see in the 50s, we've got Brown versus Board of Education, the Montgomery bus boycotts, and Little Rock High School. We see the sit-ins and the Freedom Rides kind of picking up from the success that those people had. And what they're kind of doing is they're taking things a stage further. Not only are they protesting for their own rights, but they're doing so in a way that we would call active resistance. And actually, no, we wouldn't call it active resistance at all. Oh my gosh, that's so not true. My apologies, everyone. We call it direct action. Sorry, everybody, too many phrases in my head. And the difference between passive resistance and direct action is that direct action still uses peaceful methods, like that non-violence that SNCC stands for, but they protest in a way that they know is going to provoke a reaction. very much like Rosa Parks. She knew that refusing to give up her seat was going to provoke a reaction. These guys who sat at that lunch counter in Greensboro in North Carolina knew that they were going to get a reaction. And as you see from the film in The Butler, they trained for that reaction as well. The Freedom Riders knew on that journey from Washington to Jackson, they knew it wasn't going to be easy. They knew they were going to be met with racism and arrests, and they were prepared for that. So we're kind of seeing the lengths that people are willing to go to really intensify in the early 1960s. Next, we're going to have a look at arguably the most iconic moment in civil rights history ever, maybe just in the 20th century or ever, and also one of the most famous speeches of all time. So many people have studied this speech and the way it was delivered as well. We are, of course, talking about the March on Washington in August 1963, where Martin Luther King makes his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. Let's look into some more specific details about that. The march takes place on the 28th of August 1963, and it's a form of protest, which it directly sounds like. If I was to ask you, imagine what a protest looks like, you are imagining a march. So we're talking about people literally walking down the streets, holding banners and placards, demanding certain rights be met. Okay, completely peaceful protest. The March on Washington isn't the only march to take place in 1963. It's part of a wider movement known as the Freedom Marches, and they take place across America. And before the March on Washington in August, there was a very significant march in Birmingham in Alabama in May. Now, if you're thinking, hang on, I swear we've just been talking about that. Well, you're right, we have just been talking about Birmingham, because that is where we see the horrendous violence towards the Freedom Riders take place. And that guy, again, Bull Connor, the chief of police, he again uses his police force in a way that is deeply horrifying when the images are seen across the world. This time, he doesn't give the police force the day off, but what he does is he really intensifies the police presence surrounding the march. So not only are there more police officers, he goes a step further and he brings in police dogs. And there are photographs, if you look for it on Google Images, you'll find them, of people taking part in the march in Birmingham, black people, white people as well, being set upon by these dogs, okay, literally being bitten and all sorts by these dogs. Also, to take it a stage further, as if that wasn't enough, an increased police presence, police dogs, he also employs water cannons as well. Now, this is a very popular technique that is used to put down civil unrest. Today we have quite a lot of use of tear gas and things like that, but back in the 60s it was quite common for when there were protests going on for these hoses essentially to be used. And if you imagine like the kind of hose a fire person would use and the force of water that comes out of there, that's the kind of thing we're talking about. And again, you can see pictures of it, of people being forced up against the buildings from this. And again, I'm sorry to keep dropping it in and mentioning it, but I just feel it depicts it so spectacularly accurately. It's seen in The Butler as well. And it just is absolutely horrendous. You know, these people are taking part in a peaceful protest, yet this is the way that the police responds to them. And again, those pictures are seen in news broadcasts on the front pages of newspapers around the world. And it is shocking. People are genuinely shocked. So the march in Birmingham had already set a precedent for the marches, and the March on Washington got a lot of coverage. If you think back to the pictures we were just looking at before of where the march takes place, you can see the thousands upon thousands of people who turn up to take part in the march. The march was specifically for jobs and freedom. So that's what it's known as in its full title, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. They wanted more employment rights, and they wanted essentially that. They wanted freedom. Now, there's a lot of kind of long-term history links that we can make with this event as well. 100 years before the March on Washington, 100 years beforehand, so back in 1863, that was the year that Abraham Lincoln declared the Emancipation Proclamation, which formally freed the slaves. It ended slavery in America. Yet 100 years later, the former slaves, you could argue, these black people are still not free. And they choose to have the march at the Lincoln Memorial in front of the massive statue, the massive monument dedicated to the man who ended slavery in America on purpose. They could have picked anywhere to meet and have speeches for this march, but in front of the Lincoln Memorial was the most powerful place they could deliver that message, to demonstrate that 100 years later, these black people are not free. So really symbolic and incredibly significant. We talked before about numbers taking part from that photograph. 250,000 people of all races attended the March on Washington. Black people, white people, Hispanics, lots and lots of different races attended. If you couldn't turn up, there were some cities where they were holding their own little mini March on Washingtons going on, and if you couldn't attend one of those, then it was televised across the USA. This kind of thing could never have happened 20 years earlier. Television is such a powerful tool for the civil rights movement to be able to use, to be able to reach that message from the far corners of the country, from Miami down in the south of Florida, right up to, I don't know, let's say Boston in Massachusetts, right across the coast to somewhere like Seattle in Washington state. From coast to coast, down, I'm just going to do my final fourth corner, down in San Diego in the south of California. There we go, four corners of the country were able to hear these messages. Good opportunity to make a link back here as well to the Montgomery bus boycott. Remember, the Montgomery bus boycott had 17,000 people taking part and was a real demonstration about what people power can do. When people work together in large numbers, change can happen. And the March on Washington is further evidence of that. Again, Martin Luther King makes his famous I Have a Dream speech, which is widely available to listen to. And one of my favourite little actual nuggets about the I Have a Dream speech is that the most famous part of the speech, the I have a dream that my children will grow up to live in a country where they're judged not on the colour of their skin but on the content of their character, that all of that bit there, that was completely spontaneous. The rest of his speech was really written out, and my gosh, Martin Luther King was a tremendous speech writer and a great orator, a great speaker in terms of the pace that he used, the tone, the volume, all of that, absolutely incredible. But the most iconic part was completely, well, I'm not going to say it was made up on the spot. He was actually having a conversation with someone the night before. It was a gospel singer. Her name was Malia Jackson, and Malia was stood near him on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial when he was making his speech, and she calls out to him. She says, "Tell them about your dream. Yeah, tell them about the dream that you shared with me." And he does. And that goes down to be the most iconic part and most memorable part of his speech. And it has a huge impact on people. It is so emotional. It is so evocative. People cannot help but be moved by the words that he speaks. So many of his speeches are just phenomenal to listen to. There's one that he makes towards the end of his life as well, and we're going to talk a bit more about Martin Luther King specifically in just a second, which is called the Mountaintop Speech, which is really powerful, but for very, very different reasons. It really, really is. I'm going to talk about it more actually when we talk about Martin Luther King. Let's stay focused on the March on Washington. Following the March on Washington, Martin Luther King meets with President Kennedy. It's not like Kennedy could ignore him. Yeah, I don't know if any of you have ever been to Washington, D.C. before or are aware of the geography of the layout of it, but making his speech at the Lincoln Memorial, he was practically in the president's back garden, practically in his back garden, so they couldn't be ignored. And also, 1963 is going to be the year in which Kennedy is starting to ramp up his re-election campaign. Okay, so he was elected in 1960 and he's ready to be elected again, in theory, in 1964. So he wants to be seen to be supporting these people because he can see the huge support. 250,000 people just in one city from the whole of America taking part. If he seems to be against the idea of rights for black people, then those are votes that he is going to lose. So it makes a lot of sense for him to meet with Martin Luther King. And in that meeting that they have, and in the time afterwards, Kennedy starts to make suggestions that he, if re-elected, will be able to make changes to the law regarding civil rights, in theory. Despite the huge significance, a couple of days later, moving into September 1963, in retaliation to the massive support that the March on Washington was getting and had got on that day, a church was bombed in Birmingham. Again, Birmingham, Alabama, that place where so much is happening there. And 4 young girls are killed in this bombing. And it was done intentionally by white supremacists in an attack against the popularity and the surge in support black people were getting following on from the March on Washington. So the effect of this was exactly the opposite of what those white supremacists intended. Those white supremacists intended to make black people feel like, don't forget your place, we're still here, But actually, it had a very different impact. And instead, it just brought more and more support towards the campaign for civil rights. So this isn't an uncommon thing we've seen, though, when the Brown versus Board of Education case goes ahead and the Supreme Court make their ruling about desegregating schools, we see membership of the KKK increasing. We see that happen again with the Montgomery bus boycotts as well. Every time we seem to see those steps forward being taken by these people, the white supremacists are there to try and remind them to keep them in their place. We're just going to talk a tiny bit here on Martin Luther King, just because of how significant an individual he is in the campaign for civil rights. And I just want to be really, really clear, he is not the only individual in the campaign for civil rights. There are so many people out there. I've just finished reading a book, actually, that I bought a couple of years back when I went to my favourite museum I've been to in my whole life, which is the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis in Tennessee. And I bought a book which was by, oh my gosh, can I actually see it and give you the details? I can. Give me 2 seconds, I'm just going to grab it. Here we go. So it is called A Tugging String, and it's by a guy called David T. Greenberg. And his father was a white civil rights lawyer who worked incredibly closely. Actually, he did work with Martin Luther King and many other key individuals as well. It was a great book. It's written as a novel. I don't know how widely available it is over here or if it's in libraries or anything like that, but it talks so much about the struggles faced by Black Americans, especially to do with registering to vote as well. So again, back to my original point though, Martin Luther King is incredibly significant, but remember, he is not the only person who is involved in the civil rights movement. And many historians feel that his fame really kind of cast a shadow over the contributions that other people were making. A little bit like Rosa Parks as well, you could argue. So just a couple of facts about Martin Luther King to help things tie together. So again, he's a very significant figure in the civil rights movement. I think we've got that nice and clear now. He's involved in the bus boycotts in 1957 in Montgomery and the freedom marches as well, as we've just been talking about. He very much, like I said before, is inspired by Gandhi, the idea of non-violent protest, but also forgiveness as well. Martin Luther King has a very strong religious background. He is a Baptist. His father was a Baptist minister, and he very much uses the Bible as inspiration for this idea of turning the other cheek as such, and the teachings of Jesus with that in mind. In 1964, he wins the Nobel Peace Prize, and the year is significant because not only is it a year after he makes that speech at the March on Washington, the I Have a Dream speech, but as we're going to go on to look at in just a second, it is the same year that the Civil Rights Act is passed. So quite often in history, we've got to think about, why does this happen at this time? So there's no coincidence that Martin Luther King is given the Nobel Peace Prize at this time. It's very much the coinciding of the work he's done on peaceful protest up to this point, and the fact that the Civil Rights Act is passed really demonstrates how successful he has been in the eyes of the Nobel panel. And the way that things have really gone in the 1960s is that there are so many significant individuals who were assassinated. We were talking about JFK towards the beginning of this presentation. Martin Luther King is another individual who is assassinated, and that happens in 1968. Really significant year in history, 1968. If any of you go on to study history, modern history especially, beyond GCSE, you will see just how many key events happen in history across the world in that one year. It's really jam-packed. And I talked just beforehand when we were talking about the I Have a Dream speech, I mentioned the mountaintop speech. And the mountaintop speech is a speech that Martin Luther King gave literally, I think it was either the day or a couple of days before he was assassinated. And in the speech, he says to the people, he says, I have seen the mountaintop, I have seen the promised land. And it was almost like he was predicting the death that was about to be upon him. So yeah, really, really powerful. And I talked before as well about my favorite museum, the Civil Rights Museum in Memphis in Tennessee. It's actually the museum itself it's built into the motel where Martin Luther King was assassinated, and you can see the spot where it happened, which sounds incredibly gory. You can't go like right up to it and say, oh my gosh, there it is. But the balcony that he was stood at has a floral wreath on there, so you can see like where it took place. And like I said, the rest of it, the whole museum is in the motel itself. Incredibly, incredibly powerful. So Martin Luther King, key historical figure, and kind of links a lot of the different elements that we've looked at in regards to the civil rights movement. But again, we must be aware as historians that he is not the only individual involved in the civil rights movement. We're going to move on now to take a look at the Black Power movement. Now, we haven't really spoken much, in fact, at all, about the Black Power movement to this point. As we're going to see in a second, it has its origins back in the 1920s, but very much the civil rights movement is the one that seems to pick up and take the pace a little bit more than the Black Power movement does. I want to understand a little bit about why that's the case in just a second. Just want to make something really, really clear before we do move on to it. It's not a case of the civil rights movement is good and the Black Power movement is bad, because there are positives and negatives to both of these groups. And hopefully you'll be able to see that once we go through some more details. So the origins of the concept of Black Power can be found back in the 1920s with a guy called Marcus Garvey, who founds the UNIA, the Universal Negro Improvement Association. Again, Negro, not a term that we would use today at all, but was the term that they used back then. Now, what's interesting is that the UNIA gets very little coverage up until the time that Black Power really takes the fore. And it's a shame because there's a lot of positives for what the UNIA and Black Power stood for, especially this idea of Black people having pride in their roots. The Black Power movement used to criticize the civil rights movement, that you're trying to make Black people into white people. You want them to be the same as white people. Whereas Black Power and Black Pride said you should be proud of who you are and for where you've come from. And there was lots and lots of ideas about Black people connecting with their African roots as well, for where they could, to try and work out where in Africa they came from. Plantations took a lot of records, so if they were able to trace back their ancestry to which plantation they were working on, they would in theory be able to work out which part of Africa their ancestors would have crossed the Middle Passage from. And there was a big connection as well moving into the 1960s with African culture as well. It's around this time where we start to see a lot of popular music associated with Black Power coming to the fore. A guy called James Brown, who you might well have heard of, he does this song, I feel good, da 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 da, I knew that I would. He's that guy. He also does a song called Say It Loud, I'm Black and I'm Proud. So this idea of being proud of your African heritage and the color of your skin is very much what Black Power is all about. Music starts to pick up with this theme in the 1960s. We see it in fashion as well, and one of the most kind of recognizable parts of it was with women, was with them kind of sporting this Afro style hairdo. Again, I know I've spoken about it so much, you think I've made the film, but The Butler really shows how Black Power had a strong connection with youth culture in the 1960s as well. Not all youth culture, there was lots of different groups going on for youth culture in the 1960s. I mentioned before, for instance, about the hippie movement as well, but the Black Power movement with young Black people, very much, especially in the urban cities, where a lot of working class Black people would have lived, they are the ones who are having those connections with Black Power. They are the ones who are going to be dressing with that kind of traditional African tribal style and those Afro haircuts as well. Someone who is a key inspiration for the Black Power movement is another significant individual as well, called Malcolm X. And he has got a really fascinating past and is quite often used as a parallel, a comparison to Martin Luther King. There are lots of crossovers where they have a similar background. For instance, they were both raised as Baptists. And well, I'll be honest with you, that's pretty much where the the comparison ends. Malcolm X goes through a horrific childhood. I think when he is aged around, I think he's 6 years old, he might be a year or two older, his dad is killed by the KKK in front of him. And he is from a big family, he's got lots of brothers and sisters, and his mum basically has a complete breakdown and her children are taken away from her, Malcolm obviously being one of them. And he gets into lots of trouble, and he is committing crime from a very, very young age. I'd need to check the age of him specifically, but I'm pretty confident in his late teens he was in prison for robbery. And it was at this time in prison, when he was an older teenager and going into his early 20s, that he converts to Islam. And he founds he discovers the Nation of Islam, which is a group that has been created to promote the idea of Black Power, but with connections to Islam as well. Forgive me, I don't know how much work you guys have ever done on African history, but especially in the respect of North African countries, there is a strong connection to the faith of Islam, and many of the Black people who came over from the north and kind of northwestern African territories, African countries, brought that faith with them. So it might feel like an odd kind of I was going to say clash, that's an odd thing to use, an odd mix of situation with Black and Islam, but it was incredibly common for that to be the case. And it's interesting because, as well as that, in America, there was a really strong link to the Christian faith with Black people as well. But I feel like I'm digressing. So he founds the Nation of Islam, he learns so much about the concept of Black Power, and he really becomes quite extreme in his views about that. It probably won't surprise you to hear that he wasn't born Malcolm X. That wasn't his surname. His surname wasn't X. His name was Malcolm Little. And during his time of discovering Islam and the Nation of Islam and Black Power, he changes it to X to represent the slaves who were taken from Africa and died slaves. And the reason he uses the letter X is because when a slave was asked to sign their contract with a plantation, they were of course illiterate, so the way they would sign their name would be with a cross, with essentially the letter X. So that's why he changes his name to Malcolm X. So he's very much in favour of Black Power, and he talks a lot in terms of making speeches about the importance of Black Power, but he's less focused on this idea of Black pride. He is a very proud Black man, and he believes Black people should be proud of their African roots. But he is also very much pushing this idea of active resistance, which is essentially using violence to achieve your aims. He was particularly focused on Black people having equal voting rights. Now, technically speaking, when slavery comes to an end, the law of America states that Black people are allowed to vote. However, what pretty much all of the states in America do is they put in tests for when black people want to register to vote, because you can't just turn up and say, hey, I'm here to vote. You need to have registered, you need to have your records on record, so people will be able to work out who you voted for and so on and so forth. And the kind of tests that they were given, the questions that they were asked to be able to go on the voting register, were impossible. I was talking to you before about the A Tugging String book that I was reading, and it talks about how one of the questions that people were asked to get their voting rights was, how many bubbles are there on a bar of soap? Another one I heard from somewhere else was, how many leaves are on that tree out there? So questions that are just impossible to answer. And as well as that, especially the further south you went in America, you had a lot of violent oppression to people who were trying to register to vote. So Malcolm X is saying, you know, we have a legal right to vote and we should be allowed to do so. And a famous phrase that he says is, it's the ballot or the bullet. So either you give us the ballot, the slip of paper, which allows us to vote, or you will be met with violence. And for a lot of young, black, urban people, they really take to heart what he says, and they really connect to it. It is those young, black, urban people who are really facing the worst of this prejudice, you could argue. I mean, all prejudice is disgraceful, don't get me wrong, but these people are feeling that they aren't being represented anywhere. They look to the likes of Martin Luther King and say, oh, you know, it's all right for you to talk. You know, you've had your university education, you've done your doctorate, your PhD in theology and everything, you know, with all the money you've got on your own house and so on and so forth. They really couldn't identify with him. Malcolm X, however, was just like them. Malcolm X was just like them. Malcolm X was someone that they could identify to and look up to. And so because of that, we see a big uptake in the kind of Black Power message with the young communities, the young black communities, excuse me, in the urban cities. I'm being very specific here. You may well recall from earlier, I was saying how the civil rights movement was very much attracting support from all races. Black Power is slightly different. Black Power almost saying, if you're not black, we don't want your support, is pretty much what they're saying. So it was really uncommon. I'm not going to say it didn't happen, because there's always exceptions in history, but it was incredibly uncommon to see white people supporting this concept of Black Power. And again, it's not the reason for this is because Black Power wasn't, we don't want to be the same as whites. There were some groups of Black Power movements that didn't want any kind of thing like that whatsoever. In fact, they actually wanted segregation to continue. They didn't want to live alongside white people because they saw white people as inherently evil. So they wanted to keep to their own communities still, but what they wanted was a fair segregation. So one that wasn't lesser than the other. So, you know, I'm actually realizing I'm slightly forgetting the point that I was making here. Oh, I was talking about the appeal of Black Power. So this idea that these young people were being represented. The fact I'm losing my train of thought definitely tells me I need to move on. So, oh my goodness, I'm saying exactly that. One individual that was really heavily influenced by Malcolm X is a guy called Stokely Carmichael. He was initially the leader of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and he goes on to be the leader of a group we're going to talk about in a second called the Black Panthers, who were very much not nonviolent, if you catch my drift. But Stokely Carmichael really buys into this black pride idea, and he comes up with this phrase, black is beautiful. It is not something to be ashamed of. You should not be ashamed of your skin color. Black is beautiful. There's even talk of like people trying to lighten their skin and things like that back in the 1960s. And this whole Black Power message was to challenge people who felt that that was the right thing to do. The Black Panthers have kind of gone down in history as being this huge movement of people who represented this concept of Black Power. And I tell you now, it is no coincidence that the Avengers character is called the Black Panther. I remember when I saw the first movie, I'm saying the first movie because I'm hoping there's going to be a second one, because I absolutely loved it. The Black Panther movie, the first one that came out a couple of years back, has so many messages to do with Black Power. Michael B. Jordan's character especially really communicates the messages that are recognizable in Black Power. This idea of being connected to Africa, and how certain Africans or Black people have let the other Black people down, and so on and so forth. Really, really, I felt anyway, a similar comparison to it. So, like I said, they seem to come across as a huge influence, but as you can see with the numbers here, in 1968 there were only 5,000 members across America. Put that into context, 250,000 people took part on the March on Washington. 5,000 members. The Black Power group were a militant group, and what we mean by that is they were violent. They wore a uniform and they carried weapons, and because of that there was loads of clashes with the police, lots of race riots as well, with members of these Black Power groups, the Black Panther groups being killed, and also members of the police force being killed as well. But as well as that, and this, backtrack, and that's the kind of reputation they've built up over the years. But as well as that, the Black Panthers also did a lot in terms of providing education for young people as well, not specifically surrounding Black Power, but things in general. Also supporting poorer members of their communities as well. So again, it's unfair of us to say Black Power bad, civil rights movement good, because there are positives and negatives to both movements. And then finally, that iconic moment that we saw in that picture beforehand on the right-hand side from the Mexico Olympics in 1968, where we see two Black athletes from America give the Black Power salute during a medal ceremony. And this was a big deal. This was a huge deal because the covenant of the Olympics, the rules of the Olympics state that there is to be no form of political expression anywhere in the Olympic Games. And by holding up their hands that were gloved in a black glove, that right there, making that Black Power salute, that was a political stance. And because of that, they were completely shamed at this time. They were completely shamed. And they have their titles ripped from them as well. Their medals are taken from them, and they are kind of unwritten from the Olympic records. As well as that, if you have a look back at the photograph that was on the previous slide at some point, or you can find it elsewhere possibly, the white athlete you can see on the stand, I know his first name, for the life of me I can't remember his surname. His name is Peter, and he is an Australian athlete. He actually is the one who gave these guys the idea to wear those black gloves in the actual salute moment that they have. He also wears a badge demonstrating his support for equal rights of Black people. Again, a political stance. And likewise, he is completely slated. He has his medals taken from him and everything like that too. One last thing about the three of them, particularly before I talk a little bit more about the salute they were doing, the bond between those three people lasts for their whole lives. Unfortunately, the Australian athlete is no longer with us, but the two Black athletes, and for the life of me I can only remember one of their names. How awful is that? One of their names is Tommy, and I'm sure the other one will come to me shortly. They actually carried his coffin at his funeral. So long-term connection there. As well as wearing the black gloves, one of the athletes had a black scarf around his neck as well, and that was there to represent lynching. Neither of them wore shoes because they wanted to represent this concept of poverty as well. But it was absolutely shocking. And what's interesting nowadays, when we look back at that, a lot of people in the sporting community say, oh, this is one of the greatest sporting moments of all time. So further down the line, in the long term, in the long run, this salute is, a stand of power. It's people really standing up for their rights. But at the time, it was seen as an absolute disgrace. And the American Olympic Committee was absolutely appalled by what they did. We're now just going to take a look through the laws that are passed which impact on the rights of Black Americans during the 1960s. All of the laws that we're going to have a look at here are part of Lyndon Johnson's Great Society. And if you're wondering what that is or need a reminder, we're going to be having a look at it in the last slide of this presentation. The first law we're going to look at is the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the law which is passed in the same year that Martin Luther King gets his Nobel Prize. And the act essentially states that any organisation who continues to enforce segregation will not be given any kind of government money. So that's quite a big deal in that respect. That essentially is saying no more segregation, everybody, no more segregation. And if you do, there will be consequences for that. There also is an extension in the Civil Rights Act that there is to be no more segregation in hotels and motels, restaurants and theatres as well. And when we think about theatres, we're not just talking about live performance, but also cinemas as well. 1965 is the year of the Voting Rights Act. We remember we were talking before about Malcolm X and his big push, this big campaign for the right to have the ability, to register to vote without having to take ridiculous tests and everything like that. So in 1965, Black Americans could no longer be prevented from voting, and government had to step in where there was any evidence of discrimination. And if you're wondering, well, how did they work it out? What they would do is they would look at voter turnout, and if it was if the turnout for Black Americans was below a certain percentage, forgive me, I forget what it is now, and to be honest with you, it'd probably be different in each state, then that's when the government would intervene. Why weren't there more Black Americans turning up to vote? Is it because you were stopping them from voting? That's the main way they would have worked that out. So if you're thinking, well, does that show that Malcolm X was successful? Was his message about the ballot and the bullet successful? I think it's hard to say. I don't think any government would ever want to reward violence or threats of violence. But needless to say, you know, he was very much bringing the importance of voting to the forefront of the minds of Americans. One thing I didn't mention before about Malcolm X is that, much like Martin Luther King, he was also assassinated as well. He was assassinated a couple of years earlier than Martin Luther King was. In 1967, interracial marriage was made legal. You may remember from watching the 1950s video that when the segregation laws came in the late 1870s, interracial marriage, a marriage between white and black people, the words they used were that it was to be forever prohibited. It was never going to happen. And I think it's fascinating to see that actually it's getting towards the end of the 1960s when that law is actually passed, that interracial marriage is made legal. So clearly people's minds weren't changed about that overnight when all the other civil rights acts were passed. And then finally, in 1968, we have the Fair Housing Act that made it illegal to discriminate against black people when buying or renting property. What was often the case was that black people would be charged more money to buy a house or to rent a property, and this would put an end to that. Now, again, what I don't want us to get carried away with here is that by the end of the 1960s, America wasn't a racist society anymore because they brought in all of these laws and black people had equal rights. Because one thing I'm hoping you may well have learnt from your study of history is that it's all well and good dictating what the laws say or saying what the laws say. It's another thing to get every member of your population to follow those laws. You want an example of that? Think back to Prohibition in the 1920s. It's all well and good saying that alcohol is illegal, but it's another thing for people to actually stop drinking it. So likewise, it's all well and good saying that black people have to have the same rent as a white person. It's all well and good saying that black people by law cannot be prevented from voting, but it's something very different to make sure every member of your population is actually doing that. And think about recent years, think about Black Lives Matter. And we can see that despite what we've learned in our study about Black Americans, that there is very much still this inequality that exists in America. As I mentioned at the beginning, the vast majority of our study of the 60s and 70s is about Black Americans, but it is women that is the reason that our study goes up to the year 1973. Women, as we're going to go on to talk about in a second, are very much inspired by the progress made by the civil rights movement, and they feel that the 1960s is their time to start pushing women's rights as well. You can pinpoint it to this woman here, Betty Friedan. Her name is Betty Friedan, and she wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique. And she wrote that towards the end of the 50s into the early 60s. And this book, in her book, Betty Friedan discussed how women should want more for their lives than just being a housewife. And loads of women read her book and really took to heart what she said and agreed with her. Remember about how a lot of women were frustrated that their role was very much confined to the home. Many women were also very happy to be housewives. So some people read what Friedan wrote and thought, well, I'm quite happy with my life as a housewife. I don't know what you're talking about. But a significant number of women, remember, we've got increased education of women during the 1950s. We've got more and more women in employment in the 1950s, yet still having unequal pay. A lot of them would have read this and really identified with this message that women, your life can be more than being a housewife. Don't feel that is the only option you have. In 1963, the American government passes the Equal Pay Act. Now, let's not get too excited. The Equal Pay Act did state that women and men should be paid equally. But again, there's that word. It should. They should be paid equally. But this law was not taken seriously, nor was it properly enforced as well. And the reason is that both Kennedy and his successor, Lyndon Johnson, neither of these two presidents who were in charge for the vast majority of the 1960s, neither of them were interested in women's rights. It was not a priority for them whatsoever. So that is why, even though the Equal Pay Act is passed, the law is not taken seriously at all. So to kind of ramp up this campaign, and again taking inspiration from the civil rights movement, Betty Friedan, along with a couple of other women, sets up the National Organization of Women, also known as NOW. And they are there essentially to fight for women's rights. Now, let's be careful with the term fight. It's kind of a little bit suffragettes going on here. Now, although staged protests and everything, and often would have done some radical things to get attention, they were not a violent organisation at all. And by 1970, the National Organisation of Women had 40,000 members. As well as, it's almost like a bit of a civil rights movement, Black Power movement comparison. It's a bit suffragettes here. So we've got the National Organisation of Women on one hand, and then on the other hand, we have the Women's Liberation Movement. And these are, I'm going to use the word extreme. They are more extreme. And this is where we kind of start to get the label of someone being a feminist. And that feminist becomes a kind of a dirty word almost. It's a nasty thing to call somebody. And the women's liberation movement almost acts a bit like the suffragettes in the way that the suffragettes really damage the cause of votes for women back in the early 20th century in Britain. And the women's liberation movement are also really damaging the cause for equal rights for women, because they're seen as a bit of a joke. For instance, you might have seen in the previous pictures we were looking at the Freedom trash can, which is where women would have removed their bras and burnt them in the middle of the streets, these members of the women liberation movement. And one other thing that they do, which really doesn't help their publicity at all and makes them seen as a joke again, is they ambush the Miss World competition, which is pretty much a thing of the past now, but it does still exist. And basically what they do is they drag a sheep onto the stage and take the crown off the winner of Miss World and put it on the sheep instead, and say that they're crowning the sheep as the winner of Miss World. So yeah, the women's liberation movement not doing very much for the cause of votes for women, definitely doing more harm than good. And the likes of Betty Friedan really wanted to separate themselves and the organisation of NOW from the women's liberation movement. Now, the reason our study goes into the 1970s, like I said, is to do with women, and it's to do with this final point here. In 1972, a law is passed which means that contraception is legally available to all women, including married women. At this stage, previous to this, that was not the case. So contraception is very much a creation, a discovery of the 1950s. We talked about that when we looked at women in the 50s as well, that some women are using it to make a choice between having a family and having a career. Remember, back in the 50s and into the 60s as well, when you had a child as a woman, you had to give up your job. So it was a choice. So now we're starting to see that change in attitude coming across. Then in 1973, we have quite a famous court case in America, the Roe versus Wade court case. And the result of that court case is that abortion is made legal across America. Now, this is a huge deal. Remember, there are several parts of American society that have strong religious views, Christian especially, in that kind of Bible Belt of the South. And this is a law that is passed to great controversy and a lot of outcry. And you will still see in America today, there is lots and lots of protests relating to being anti-abortion and anti-choice. You could argue. So that is I think, embarrassingly short run through of rights for women. I wish there was more of a coverage of women's rights in the AQA GCSE history, but nonetheless, those are the key points that you would have been taught about that. And the final thing that we're going to have a look at is the works of President Kennedy and President Johnson on trying to make America a better place for everyone to live in. Just want to talk really quickly about the connection between these two people. So President Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, is elected in 1960. Lyndon Johnson, the guy on the right-hand side, is his vice president. So when Kennedy is assassinated, he is killed in late 1963. Lyndon Johnson takes over because that is the law of America. That is the Constitution. It says that should the president die, then the vice president takes over. So Lyndon Johnson takes over and he remains as the American president into the following year, 1964, which is the election year, and he is then elected as the new president of America. He'll only serve one term, though, because Lyndon Johnson is the president who gets America involved in the Vietnam War, and that is incredibly unpopular with the American people. But when he's voted in 1964, he says to the American people, vote for me and I will carry on what President Kennedy was doing. So a lot of people vote for President Johnson because they liked President Kennedy and they trusted him in saying, I will carry on with Kennedy's legacy. Kennedy was really, really good at dealing with foreign affairs. He was really good at dealing with other countries and diplomacy. You may be aware, for instance, of the Cuban Missile Crisis that takes place during his presidency. He was not, however, very good at dealing with problems in American society. Johnson, however, was the complete opposite of that. He was not very good at dealing with foreign policy, but he was very good at domestic policy, dealing with problems in America itself. So the two agendas that each person had for making America a better place to live in was the New Frontier for JFK and the Great Society for Lyndon Johnson. LBJ are his initials. Now, one of the things that's important for us to remember is this idea that Lyndon Johnson is voted as president by the American people because he promises to put Kennedy's ideas into action. He will carry on with Kennedy's legacy. So the New Frontier is basically seen by historians as the ideas for making America a better place, and the Great Society is putting those ideas into action. The big commonality between the two is that it is very much focused on helping the poor. And the way that they do that is they cut taxes and they increase the minimum wage ever so slightly, and it increases a little bit over the 1960s. And they also clear up slum areas, so areas where living conditions are really poor. They put money into clearing up those areas. This, again, is an idea that's put forward by Kennedy, but Johnson really pushes for these ideas. Medicare provides healthcare for the elderly, and Medicaid provided healthcare for poor people, or at least funding to help with that. As some of you may be aware, healthcare in America is not free. You have to pay for it. There is no national health service in America. So this was a massive step forward. There are no benefits for the elderly. There is no such thing as a pension, for instance. There's no such thing as unemployment benefit in America either. So the ideas from Kennedy's New Frontier and Johnson's Great Society, and again, I just want to reiterate, Johnson really pushes with this a lot more than Kennedy ever did. Kennedy just kind of fitted it round as an idea. Johnson is like, no, we are going to do this. Is that the elderly and the poor should have a right to healthcare. So that is what is put in place, Medicare and Medicaid. It is no way near as extreme as the National Health Service. There is no way the American people would stand for that, but it is definitely a step towards the government helping the more vulnerable members of society. There was also a focus on young people in the New Frontier and the Great Society. There was lots done in terms of funding for education, but also there are two different establishments that are created. The Peace Corps, which is created by John F. Kennedy, and that still exists today, where young Americans, and by young Americans I'm talking like university age here, would go abroad to impoverished countries and help to like build schools and hospitals and things like that. And Johnson comes up with his own version of this called VISTA, the Volunteers in Service to America, which essentially does the same thing, but rather than going to impoverished countries elsewhere, you go to poor areas of America. So it was this idea of people giving back to the country. Kennedy, in his inauguration speech, which is the speech that a president makes when they are first elected, is ask not what this country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Both Kennedy and Johnson believe that the American people should give back to the country of America and give back to society. And we can see that coming through in how they wanted to engage young people with that. I mentioned this before. Johnson was really good at dealing with problems at home. He was really good as well at working with the Southern politicians. Something I haven't mentioned is that Johnson was from Texas, and he was a tall guy. He was a really intimidating physical presence, and he had a kind of character and personality where he could be really quite forceful in putting his points across. And because of that, he was able to kind of put the Southern politicians in their place, which is something up to this point in our study no president has been able to do. But because Johnson was a Southerner himself, he was able to get the Southern politicians on side and put them in their place. So he was really good with dealing with problems in America. But like I said, he did terribly with the war in Vietnam. And some of you may well have studied the Vietnam War as part of your Cold War study or part of your international relations study. And because of this, there was no chance people were going to re-elect him. And he didn't even run for presidency in 1968. The president that takes over after him, who is elected, is someone you may well have heard of before, a guy who is also got a bit of a checkered past in terms of his role as the president, a guy called President Nixon. But for the benefits of our study, we don't need to be worried about him. And that brings us to the end. I am absolutely hoarse. I'm nearly losing my voice from talking so much about that, but it was really, really great to tap into some of the ideas that are bringing together and also have a chance to talk to you about some of the further historical thinking surrounding these. As always, I hope you found this useful. I hope you found it enjoyable. Don't forget you can subscribe to the channel if you click on the link there and press the little bell notification thingy and you'll get that sent through. You can follow me on Twitter and Instagram at OneHistoryHelp, and I'm on Facebook too, where you can search One History Help and you'll find me there. Right, I'm going to go have a lie down because I am absolutely shattered from doing that there, guys. Hope you're keeping well, and again, I really do hope you find this useful. See you next time. Bye bye.